All right. Azure Data Factory, Azure Databricks, or Azure Synapse Analytics. When to use what? I think almost everybody except for Martijn doesn't know me yet. So my name is Lisa Hoving. I work as an Azure data engineer with Intercept. Intercept is a very small company in Zwolle actually, but I live in Hilversum, so I was not too far away. The work that I do for Intercept is I help migrating customers to and within the cloud. So if you have a data solution and you want to move to the cloud, I can help with data designs, doing the workload, whatnot, whatever customers like, basically. What are we going to talk about today? So when I made this talk, I thought, okay, if I want to explain what tool is right when, it would be nicest to use a use case because, you know, this speaks the most to the imagination, I guess. So I made up a fictitious person. His name is Henk. I think Henk is like a pretty straightforward Dutch name, but I'm still waiting for somebody to actually be named Henk. I don't think I have the pleasure here today because we have a pretty international crowd. But if your name is Henk, this talk is for you. So if we want to make a decision for Henk, we need to know first what is Azure Data Factory, what is Azure Databricks, and what is Azure Synapse Analytics. Then after this, we're going to compare these tools based on functionality, based on costs, based on performance. And then lastly, we're going to try to make our decision in a more subjective way. In the end, of course, we're going to reach our conclusion when to use what. It's good to note that today we're going to see a very simplified view of these tools because these tools by itself can be days and days of courses in order to really get it going, right? As I already mentioned, decisions can be subjective, so it's good to note what my bias is when you listen to me speaking. I've been working with Azure Databricks a lot. It's one of my preferred tools. It's the tool that I started off using from the beginning, so that's going to be my preference, of course. I'm a data engineer, so my point of view is mostly going to be data engineering. If you want to know about data science or data analysis, that's not usually the view I have. I try to incorporate it, of course, but my background is still data engineering. If you want, and you have experience with these tools, you are free to join the conversation and tell me, hey, your opinion is quite subjective and, you know, my experience is different. Just know that when you do so, you're standing in between your colleagues and beer. So if the conversation gets too large, you know, try to keep it in mind. So we can have a lot of discussion. This talk is going to be about 40 minutes. So if we discuss more, then it will take longer, of course. Okay, so just to start, who has experience using Azure Data Factory? Of course, Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics. All right, quite a diverse crowd, I would say. Not to worry, we'll cover all of these tools. Okay, Henk. This is Henk. Henk is your run-of-the-mill BI specialist. So he has been working for a large insurance company for about 20 plus years. Like Henk has the knowledge, right? What he can do, he can make all of your graphs look super fancy. I'm jealous because that's not something I can do. He has some experience with Azure SQL Server, so he has some experience in the cloud. He can program SQL, of course, but he has dabbled a little bit in Python as well. Henk, being your typical Dutch guy, will never pay a penny too much. And Henk, like us all, likes cats. Okay, what does Henk need to do? He needs to aggregate sales, the sales that people have, you know, sold for his company on salesperson per month. Because his manager would like to know what salesperson has outperformed throughout the years and who has done the best job. The sales data he has is about 6 million records over the last 3 years. And it's stored, this is pretty standard for us data engineers, in Parquet format. What does this data look like? So we can see the date on which the sale was closed, the person who closed the sales ID, and the product ID, of course. Makes it easy to look it up. What the product is called, might be a mortgage, might be health insurance, and the sales amount. These salespeople have been really busy, right? So what do we know? Hank has Parquet data over the last 3 years, about 6 million records. We're going to go to Azure, right? So we're going to store it in a storage account. Pretty standard. In the end, Hank, being a BI guy, he's going to visualize this in Power BI, of course. But what tool are we going to use in between? That we don't know. So, right off the bat, what do you think Hank should choose? Because once we've made the decision, we cannot go back, right? Migrating back, that's going to be a very bad time. So who thinks it should be Azure Data Factory? Or Databricks? Or Synapse Analytics? You don't want it to be Synapse Analytics. No. But who knows, maybe, might be. But let's start with Azure Data Factory. So what is Azure Data Factory? Azure Data Factory is a data integration tool. That means that we can do data ingestion, so getting the data from point A to point B. And we can do data transformation, so we can substitute new null values, we can cast data types, we can do aggregations, and all of that fancy stuff. In ADF, you don't need to know how to code, so all of the developers are going to be like, oh my god, it's a GUI, yes, a drag and drop tool. In this drag and drop tool, we have pipelines, data flows, and Power Query. For the people that use Power BI, I don't think there will be many, but this kind of looks like Power BI, but you can do your transformation and ingest, hello, with it as well. All right. So the computational power of Azure Data Factory comes from the integration runtime. If you want to have Spark on data flows, you can do that as well. And then you just have to select the data flows. Azure Data Factory, as they say, has 90 built-in data sources, but they've been saying this for a while, so it might be a little bit more that I don't know. But that's pretty neat. What does this look like? Is this visible? I think so, right? Yeah, it's fine. Okay. So what you see here is I've created pipelines, and this is called aggregate sales, so that's the use case of Hank. I have 2 data flows here ready. One is from another workshop, but this is the data flow that you can see here as well. And you have Power Query, which I have created none of. And then you can see all of the separate tasks here. So I'm importing some data, I'm doing some aggregation, some sorting, and then I'm syncing it back to storage. So this is your typical GUI. Maybe the most important question is, why shouldn't you use Azure Data Factory? So one of the things that is commonly known is that these 90 integrated data sources, you can just connect to them out of the box, just configure them by hand. But what if yours is not included? You're going to have a bad time, right? And because of this graphical user interface, there's little flexibility beyond what's already available, right? So if you want to do anything that ADF cannot do out of the box, we're going to have a bad time. If you want to create generic pipelines, which is very easily done in code, then in ADF this is very difficult because you have to configure everything by hand. If you have data pipelines that are not optimized correctly and are not running as you want them to, due to the GUI again, it's very difficult to go under the hood and fix this, as you could do with code. So these are the downsides of Azure Data Factory, even though it's pretty handy if you don't know how to code. What about Databricks? Databricks is what they call a data analytics platform. You can do a little bit more with this than you can with Azure Data Factory. We can do data ingestion and data transformation, but we can also solve data analysis, data science use cases. If we want to integrate Power BI, there is native Power BI integration, so if you want to do your visualizations, we can do it there as well. It's getting pretty hot, no? Just me? Okay. Cool. Multiple disciplines can use Azure Databricks. So being data engineers like me, data scientists can do their data science workload, and data analysts and BI specialists can use SQL as well. Nice. In Databricks, usually we will do our work using notebooks. They are a bit similar to the Jupyter notebooks that some of you might be acquainted with. You can set up a cluster within minutes. People that have worked on-premise, I don't know, Hadoop clusters, Cloudera, whatnot, know that this is a pleasure. Databricks always ensures, and they do this better than Synapse in my opinion, they always ensure that you can run the latest version of Apache Spark. So if you want to be, the kid that has the fanciest tools, probably use Databricks. The languages that you can use here are Python, Scala, R, Java, and SQL. It's good to note the R and Java ones because this is not the same as you have it with Synapse Analytics. All right. So this is an example of a Databricks notebook. What you can see here is that I have created a notebook called Experts Live. That's where I'll be in a few days. We have a cluster here with the grayed out dot. You can see that the cluster is not running. I think that's a pretty neat feature. And then here I have a block of code, and that block of code is basically the use case of Hank. So I'm just reading in the data, aggregating it, sorting it, and then writing it back to storage. Okay. That sounds pretty amazing, but why should we not like Databricks? Well, I'm a fanboy, of course, so we should always use Databricks. But if you want to use Databricks, think about it. You need to have a little bit more technical knowledge to set it up correctly. I will show you an example later on. If you want to write good code, people that know how to code in this room, they know that this takes a specific skill set. It's very difficult to do it right. And Databricks, I don't know if everybody knows that here, but Databricks is a tool that is not created by Microsoft. So if you are on the Azure platform, you will find that sometimes connecting data sources is going to be a little bit odd. And what we've seen lately is that now they've introduced the Unity catalog, and all of a sudden, instead of mounting your storage account to Databricks, they are saying, oh, you can use managed identities and stuff like that, so you have to migrate. And these are things in Databricks that are just a little bit less easy to do. Because if you deploy Synapse, for example, then you get a storage account for free and everything is set up from the get-go. But not in Databricks, I'm afraid. So if you want to connect data sources, keep in mind it's going to be a little bit easier in other tools like Synapse and Data Factory, of course. But still, it's a pretty neat tool. The maturity is quite high. But what happens if in the portal you don't give somebody rights to access the Databricks workspace, but in your Databricks workspace, actually that person has access. These types of access, they don't talk to one another. So this is what happens. I hope it works. I think, yeah. So I'm logged in under my user, as you can see. There is no Databricks workspace, so I cannot find it. But I have remembered what the URL was to the Databricks workspace. And because I'm an admin here, I can just log in and do whatever I like, even though I don't have access in the portal. So think about this. You have to think about the access in the portal, in the workspace, who has access to what data, who can see what, but more importantly, who cannot see some data, because you don't want your data to fall in the wrong hands. This is different than Azure Data Factory, where it's a little bit more easy because there's no data stored there.
So if you compare this from like seeing the virtual machine in the portal and logging over SSH?
I think so, yeah. Yeah. So think about it. All right. Azure Synapse Analytics. So Azure Synapse Analytics is quite a comprehensive platform. You see the same type of functionality here: data ingestion, data transformation, analysis, and visualization. Synapse Analytics has native Power BI integration, so you can connect tools to one another, which is pretty neat if you're a BI guy like Hank. Multiple disciplines can use Azure Synapse Analytics: data engineers, data scientists, data analysts, and BI specialists. All right, I'm seeing some similarities here. This comprehensive platform has some places that you can go and look at data. So we have our data lake. If you want to query structured and unstructured data, we can use Spark pools to do so. If we want to query more structured data, then we can go to the data warehouse, use our SQL pools. Can be either dedicated or serverless. If you want to do data integration, which is called Synapse Pipelines, which is basically a one-on-one copy of Azure Data Factory, but just a little bit less functionality, I suppose, then we can use the Synapse Pipelines. We have our drag and drop tool. It's integrated in Synapse Analytics. It's pretty neat if you have colleagues that don't know how to code, but still want to use Synapse Analytics. Of course, this runs on the integration runtime. And we have a Data Explorer in preview. I think the name is a bit old, but it's usually for querying log data. We have our Data Explorer pools to run on that. The languages that we have here are Python, Scala, SQL, and .NET. So if you're a .NET developer, I don't know if there are here, then Synapse Analytics is going to be your tool. If you want to do Java, if you want to do R, then Databricks is going to be your tool. What does it look like? So this is a notebook. Again, this looks pretty similar to Jupyter notebooks. I think they're both run on it under the hood as well. Maybe Martijn knows that. At least Databricks, that I know for sure. So what you can see here, the notebook, it's called Notebook. Here you can see that it starts it to a Spark cluster. Here I cannot see whether it's running or not, so I think I should probably change that. And here I have the same code I had within Databricks. So I just implemented Hank's use case, load in data, aggregate it, sort it, saved it back to storage. Well, here you can see all the different steps that Synapse took. And they were all succeeded. That's pretty nice, I guess. Much as with Databricks, what are the downsides? Again, Synapse Analytics takes technical knowledge in order to set it up right. Think about the rights to your storage account. Think about who can see data in your SQL pools, who can even access the Synapse Analytics workspace, right? You have to do this right, or you're going to have a bad time. Now, again, writing good code takes a specific skill set. One of the major downsides of Azure Synapse Analytics, I guess this is like a well-known secret, but it's its maturity. But I just want to say, oh, it's not a mature, leave it at that. Let's consider an example that I've run into when I was implementing Hank's use case. So what I did here was I had this cell of code and I aggregated the sales amount to do it on salesperson per month and year to get per month, what salesperson outperformed. This aggregate sum of sales is an out-of-the-box functionality of Spark. So this is something that is, you don't have to do an import in order to get really, this function. It's out of the box, nothing fancy. Well, Spark and Parquet as a format doesn't limit me to use brackets. So if I would run this code in, for example, Databricks, it will run just fine, no problem. But the Spark used by Synapse Analytics, so how this thing works, does limit me to use these characters. So I still get an error. I say, oh, well, this run-of-the-mill normal function that you're using actually makes a column name which uses brackets, and you can actually not save this as a Parquet format. I think, okay, that's pretty nice, never seen that before. And all of these small issues are issues that people usually run into when they start programming Spark on Azure Synapse Analytics. Microsoft does, spend a lot of money in order to get this better, so over time it has improved a lot already, I think, but still if you compare it to Databricks, this is my subjective opinion, Databricks is more mature, so it's good to know. Okay, so what did we learn? If we think about Azure Data Factory, the functionality is pretty straightforward. So it's for data ingestion and it's for data transformation. We can use Spark, but this is with the data flows that we've seen. And it's not for data science, it's not for data analysis, it's not for data visualization. It's just for data ingestion and data transformation. If you want to have a drag and drop tool, be ready fast, then Azure Data Factory is the tool for you. Question that I get often asked is, okay, Azure Data Factory is a factory, right? So where do I store the data in Azure Data Factory? The answer is you do not. So it's not a data storage tool. Then if we get to Azure Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, the differences become smaller and smaller. In Databricks, of course, we use primarily code. Meanwhile, in Synapse Analytics, we have these pipelines integrated. But functionality-wise, it's one-on-one the same. We can do the same things. If we talk about data storage, it becomes a bit questionable because in Synapse Analytics and Databricks, we don't really store data. But with Synapse Analytics, if you deploy it, then you get a free storage account for free. You get it with it. It's not for free. You get it with it, and it's mounted. It's connected, ready to go. But you don't store your data in Azure Synapse Analytics. We do it in the storage account, and it's the same with Databricks. You get some storage with it, but it's not for storing actual data. And please don't. Please don't store actual data in Azure Databricks. Okay, so now we've heard all of these tools. Who thinks Hank should go with Data Factory? He could do it, right, from a perspective. Okay. Who thinks it should be Databricks? I mean, I like Databricks. Synapse Analytics? Yeah? Okay, some Synapse Analytics fanboys. Good. Go for you. I'm just teasing. All right. So Hank is starting to think, oh, if I can choose all of these tools, what should I do? I mean, I can code, so I could do Spark. I could do Azure Data Factory. Okay, fine. Just give me the cheapest tool. I'm Dutch. Just give me the cheapest tool. I'll be done with it. Fair enough. That was out of the question, of course. We're Azure fanboys here. Okay, good. Can we compare costs in these tools? The answer is sadly enough, it's incredibly difficult. Just think about it. If we want to compare costs, then how are we really going to compare costs of Synapse pipelines with Databricks Spark, or SQL in Databricks and SQL in Synapse Analytics? How are we going to compare these costs? Yes, we'll get to that in a second. Yeah?
I think it's not so easy for the comparison.
Yeah.
Complain a little bit, sorry.
It's fine.
I think the Synapse span, I'm not so much so big.
Yeah.
Synapse span, but I think Synapse in this type of scenario, I think Synapse more for really huge, or let's say a lot amount. That's my personal opinion. That's why I said, can I complain or do I?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And Synapse most expensive. I will answer on this question or
Yeah.
topic because in the background is using a bunch of services.
Yeah.
And everything is connected in Synapse.
Yeah.
Really good.
Yeah.
But as I mentioned, I think the only difference may be like myself, Databricks and on another level maybe Synapse. Also for the cost.
Yeah.
On more higher level and really expensive tool.
Yeah.
Not every company can use the Synapse.
I think you have a very valid point. If you think about the SQL dedicated pools, for example, then I think the price starts at €1,000 per month or something like that. I do have some idle Synapse Analytics workspaces in my account that cost me nothing because there's no resources on it. So there are Spark pools that you could deploy. Let's get to that right now. That only costs $156 per hour. So you could do this very cheaply if you wanted to. Even though there are some maturity issues with that as well, we've had customers that have idle Synapse Analytics workspaces that just start to amount costs like €6,000 per month, just sitting idle. You think, oh no. So yeah, that takes some time. So okay, it's very difficult to compare costs because of all these technology differences, but what if we try Spark? Because Spark is one of these tools that is utilized in all three of these tools, right? So the issue that we have right off the bat is that you can get similar clusters, but you cannot get equal clusters. They make it really difficult for you. And so I tried to make 3 similar clusters, and here you can see that Data Factory is one of the most expensive tools, $215 per hour for this cluster. And Databricks was by chance the cheapest one. It's just good to know that you can forget most about for the people that want to be really specific, but Synapse Analytics has a little bit more nodes than also it's a bit more expensive. But even if we were to say, okay, well, Data Factory is the most expensive one, then Synapse, then Databricks, then, okay, as I mentioned, these tools don't use the same cluster, also optimize differently. So the type of Spark that they use is not the type of Spark that you can download for free from the Apache website. They actually try to optimize all of these clusters under the hood as well, which means all of these clusters perform different from one another. So you cannot really easily say this, just looking at the costs. However, if you are so inclined to do so, want to make a decision based on costs, then in our experience, if you talk about Spark, so just talking about Spark, not about the SQL pools, whatnot, data flows come at a premium. So if you don't want to code, you want to use data flows, it's good to know that you're probably going to pay more than if you were to implement it using Databricks or Synapse Analytics. Okay, so Henk thinks if that's a bad way to go about it, then just give me the tool that finishes the fastest, because who likes to wait, right? So I tried to implement the use case of Henk using the clusters that I have shown before. And here you see the processing time. I ran it 3 times. So you can see that what Azure Data Factory does is it does not cache. So all of these runs will finish about equally fast, but Databricks and Synapse Analytics do. So the second time, third time, they finish a lot faster. Now, if you compare the costs of the cluster with the processing time, then you find that for the use case of Henk, Data Factory is the most expensive, then we have Synapse Analytics, and then we have Databricks. Okay. So Henk thinks that's fine, but am I really going to base this decision on one use case? Do we really make a decision based on one use case if we want to pick a tool? I don't think so. So what about other use cases if we want to use Synapse SQL versus Databricks SQL, or if we want to store our data in a Delta format instead of a Parquet format? Are the performance differences then going to be the same as well? Probably not. Oh no. Okay. And even if we were to test all of these things right now, then it's a moving target. So I did a similar talk, I think, 4 months back, and I tested again. Everything is different. So Databricks and Synapse especially, every quarter they come out with a new release, and all of the performance differences are, again, different. So should we really base a decision on performance? I don't think so. I think they are rarely a good decision maker. But again, if you are so inclined to do so, at this moment, it seems to be that general consensus is that Azure Databricks performs best or at least as good as Synapse Analytics when it comes to Spark. So, but it might be different tomorrow. That I don't know. Okay, so Henk thinks, I cannot make the decision based on what the tools can do, cannot make the decision based on costs, and also the best performing one was quite difficult, so what am I left off with actually? Maybe we make our decision more subjectively. In my experience, if you don't know how to code, and your data sources are natively integrated with Azure Data Factory, and you're willing to pay that premium, go ahead and use Azure Data Factory. It's easy to set up, it's easy to get going. If you don't have that much experience, feel free to do it. But if you want to make a decision between Databricks and Azure Synapse Analytics, it's a little bit more difficult. In my experience, if I make the decision for our customers, I usually think about maturity and integration. As we've seen, Azure Databricks, it's well known to be a good platform. It's mature, it's user-friendly. But Synapse Analytics integrates better, in my opinion, within the Azure platform. If you have colleagues that don't know how to code, you have your GUI and code integrated in the tool as well, and it gives you a familiar look and feel for users that are acquainted with the platform, and connecting data sources is a little bit easier. So, let me ask you this once more. What do you think Henk should choose? Azure Data Factory? Nobody cares about data. Okay, one, maybe. Databricks? Synapse Analytics? Okay. It's not that easy, right? It is not. So as I mentioned, this comes in handy for users that don't know how to code. If you want to solve data science, data analysis, or data visualization use cases, Data Factory is not the tool for you. It offers us less flexibility than we had if we were to code. It's difficult to create these generic pipelines. If you want to use Apache Spark, data flows does come at a premium. It's good to keep that in mind. Databricks offers us a mature and user-friendly platform, but setting it up does take technical knowledge, so think about it before you do it. Synapse Analytics, again, think about it before you implement it, but it does offer us a well-integrated platform on Azure, and it might give you a look and feel that you are familiar with. And this is exactly the reason why I would advise this to Henk, because Henk is a Power BI guy, right? He's a BI specialist. He knows Azure SQL Server. So most likely Azure Synapse Analytics is going to give him on Spark the more cheap option compared to Azure Data Factory. And it will give you this look and feel that he's familiar with comparing to Azure SQL Server. So I don't think, is it well readable? No. So again, if you know how to code, pick Azure Databricks or Azure Synapse Analytics. The decision is between a mature platform or an integrated one on Azure. If you don't know how to code, you don't want to learn, your data sources are natively integrated within Azure Data Factory, and you don't have many complex transformations, you don't want to create generic pipelines, go with Azure Data Factory. Well, thank you very much. Again, my name is Lisa. If you want to tweet me, it's at Lizard08. I want to have 007, but for some reason that one was taken already. Are there any questions?